our pilgrimage to Turkey. Trip to Turkey, and we, from the beginning, called it a pilgrimage. And then we started asking, what's a pilgrimage? And how's it different? Is it different than a tour or a visit, a trip to Turkey? And if so, how? And I think we sort of discovered that and created that as we went. But it was the idea of pilgrimage was central to what our two trip leaders had in mind when they organized this particular visit to Turkey. And the organizers of this trip were the current senior pastor, Sarah Campbell, of Mayflower United Church of Christ in South Minneapolis, and one of her predecessors in that role, Bud Friend Jones, who was pastor there how long ago? 10 years? 15?
Mid-90s.
Mid-90s. Okay.
And he had been at the Plymouth congregation.
And he'd been at Plymouth also. And so they had this this vision of how they wanted to visit Turkey. They did it once before, 2 years ago. And it started by parishioners at Mayflower, several of whom are here today, thankfully. And then a few others added on. Rachel will say a word about how we happened to add on. And there were some folk from Plymouth Congregational Church. There were a couple of Mennonites from Faith Mennonite Church. There was a Lutheran woman from South Minneapolis. And there were some UCC national staff people from Cleveland and from Atlanta that really brought a lot to the delegation. I'm probably missing some very important ones.
D.C.
Yeah, from Washington, D.C. And then, of course, there was our Turkish guide, Dündar, a very extraordinary
He's
guide.
number 36 in the t-shirt there.
And he was extraordinary, you know, just as an energized human being, but also as a scholar of archaeology, a scholar of classical literature. And there were so many things he could bring to this, and a humorist. And of course, he was a newlywed, and his wife, a young Russian woman, was with us, and she brought so many wonderful gifts as well to the delegation. So it was a wonderful delegation. And let me, just to return to the theme of pilgrimage, some of the things that for me made it different than a sort of a more traditional tour where we spent a lot of time, at least once a day as a group, sharing our reflections, our thoughts, and our feelings about what we had experienced that day. Very simply, it was called, Yummies and Crummies?
Roses and Thorn.
Roses and Thorn, yes, yes. But that's kind of the framework we use. You know, what did we experience today that had touched us or been positive, or what was a downer, and so on. And we had some of both every day, of course, but that was very important. We did some prayer life together almost daily, some scripture reading from different texts, not just the Bible. Some of that on the bus as we traveled. And what else made it a pilgrimage?
Well, one quote that Sarah gave us was that a tourist is one who travels through the land, and when the land travels through the tourist, you become a pilgrim. You know, when you let the country enter into yourself and are open to that. And so that we went in and out of that. We were very much tourists in a lot of ways.
Yeah. But that's spirit of opening oneself to whatever gifts may be each day.
What really drew me in when I saw the flyer at Mayflower Church was that it was a trip seeking the feminine divine, or the holy wisdom, and kind of tracking pre-Christian territory in Anatolia, which is another name for Turkey. And the name Anatolia means full with mothers. So as those of you who know a lot more than I do about the pre-Christian times and early history, there was a lot of egalitarian societies where men and women were working in shared ways to live and sustain themselves. And a lot of archaeology has been unearthing bits and pieces and evidence of worship of the feminine deity. So I was really intrigued by that, and that's what drew me in that focus. And one site that we did visit was Çatalhöyük, and that is in the heart of Turkey, just south of Konya. It's on the short list to be a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it began to be unearthed in the late 60s. And so it was a wonderful stop, but we had to move on because we had another engagement later. So Çatalhöyük is a Neolithic village about 9,000 years old. So if I were to go back to Turkey, I'd go back and look around there a little more closely. But we did buy a useful book about that place that's a good guide for later. And another site, that's one of the old houses at Çatalhöyük. There's the Mother Goddess, they think. There's a lot of discussion about whether she really was worshipped or is she just representing fertility, and the archaeologist who found her believes that she was worshipped. But that original statue is in the capital city in Ankara in the museum there. Then we traveled toward the Aegean Sea, and not far from Ephesus is a site of Aphrodisias, and it was a major city in pre-Christian times. Our guide said similar to Florence because it was a gathering for artists, and all the land is rich with marble. So in Aphrodisias, they were doing all kinds of artwork with sculptures, and the big thing was the sarcophagus. So people in Italy would order their tomb here in Aphrodisias, and it was an amazing sight of sarcophagi. So Aphrodite, who was originating in the island of Cyprus near Turkey, she was one of the deities, pre-Christian deities, and in this city, which was built of all of marble, this was the gateway to her temple. And the temple, of course, has not sustained itself over the years, but they did rebuild the gateway, and that's what this is. And they did that in the 1960s. So we toured in this site, and there were other parts of the area, the theater and the stadium. What's interesting here, though, is that when the Christians, when Paul came up from the south and the Christians were kind of moving north and into Anatolia from Canaan, then they bumped into the pagans, worshiping Aphrodite. So there was a lot of tension here about who to worship. And so this was converted, the temple of Aphrodite was converted to a church about 500 AD. And so it went into another form. And then a lot of earthquakes destroyed a lot of these beautiful things that we were seeing. So that's an example of what they would carve out of the marble for people who wanted to be entombed in such a thing. There was a field of about 31 of these. And this is Aphrodite. Her head, the screen is cutting off her head, but this was in the museum. Then we went to Ephesus, which is not far, but the Temple of Artemis that Don referred to is right next to Ephesus. And all that remains, I have a picture of one column and Jim Bush, our pilgrim there. But it was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, as Don mentioned. And there were 127 columns that were moved to London, to the museum, after it was unearthed. So that move, plus earthquakes again, destroyed the Temple of Artemis. But the picture in the Rhodes Scholar book, I mean, it's just this huge, huge temple. And Artemis was very appealing to the Amazon women who originated in northern Anatolia, and they would come to Artemis to worship at the temple. And so all of the battles, there's a lot of, we weren't able to see much of that, but in the one museum we saw one of the Amazon women being slain by Achilles. And so there was that tension between strong women and the other warring men. So a lot of interesting things here. So Ephesus, then, Don will pick up a bit with how Paul came to Ephesus, but the famous library is at the base of the hill. And
I mean, this city, and some of you have probably been there, is just amazing. It is so huge. It is so intact. It was one of the, it was one of the great cities of the ancient world, probably one of the 4 great cities, and it's just amazing.
I want to note, up on the hillside, on that little mountain is where we went next to the Grotto of St. Paul, but I wanted to point that hillside out because it was way high. It was so. This is the amphitheater from our hike up the hill.
That could see. Was it about 30,000? Is that right? Numbers fade, but I think it was 20 to 30. There were a lot of figs growing wild, and it was fall, so they were ripe, and they were delicious. I'm going to pick up a little bit around Ephesus with the coming of Paul and Christianity. And of course, we know a little about that from our scriptures. That's about all we know about this. It's from our scriptures. But Paul made 3 journeys here between about 47 and 55 AD. And one of them, he stayed quite a while in Ephesus, quite a few months. And of course, we have stories of when social conflicts developed between him and others that were profiting from the other religious groups and their artifacts. And Paul's barely escaped his life on one of those. But one of the things we did here in this picture, we got off the beaten path and we went on a hike up to the hillside, the mountainside behind that amphitheater, to a place called the Grotto of St. Paul. And this, as I understand it, our guide and our 2 pastors made several attempts to get permission to go and visit the grotto, because it's not part of the tourist trail. But finally we were given permission. I'm not sure how. And we went up this trail, and Bud, can we see Bud in this picture?
Yeah. He's in the far corner picture.
Yeah. Bud, one of our leaders, had broken his foot just before we started this pilgrimage. But he was absolutely determined to get to this grotto. And so you should have seen us pushing Bud and pulling Bud and supporting Bud. And he had a walking cast on his foot, and he had a cane. And we were as determined as he was to get him there. we wanted to get there too, but we had to get Bud there. And we finally made it. And you see here, this man over here seated was a local person, and he was there with a big mirror. And so his job was to help us to go inside. It was totally dark, but help us to see these frescoes painted on the walls of this cave by reflecting sunlight into the cave with this big mirror. We couldn't have done much without him. And so here we have an ancient fresco, maybe from the 10th century, I don't know exactly, of Paul and somebody. And the somebody, of course, became of great interest to us. And from the ancient Greek letters, you can see, well, it's Thecla. Well, who is Thecla? I mean, Thecla does not appear in the New Testament. And so we have to go to the Orthodox community, the Eastern Christian community, and even Islam to get stories about and information about Thecla. Well, what we know about Thecla from those sources is that she was a young woman from Konya, originally in this area, a big city not far from Ephesus, who met Paul in Ephesus when she was 17. Now, of course, throughout the trip, one of the things that was so fascinating was taking in everything, and then everyone is left to decide, is this history, is this legend, what are we hearing, what are we seeing? And that's the wonderful mystery of it all. But according to the legends of Thecla, she became a devotee of Christianity and was converted by Paul. And she was very bright. She was betrothed to be married at 17, and she left her fiancé. She left her family.
That's her mother.
Her mother there on the left. Yeah, she made it into the fresco also. And Thecla dressed as a young man, cut her red hair, and began following Paul. Well, apparently he did not baptize her. We don't know if he wouldn't, or he didn't, or he couldn't. She baptized.
He didn't want her to travel with him.
Yeah, that's what we heard. He didn't really want her. It was so unusual. I mean, it didn't happen that a young woman would leave her family and go on the road like this. And so maybe he was trying to protect her. But she would not abandon Christianity. So she ended up, well, we'll get to that in a minute. But this was a wonderful story to hear about the feminine divine, about the early church leaders that I had never heard. Most of us had not. And maybe some of you have. Yes.
How was a grotto like this used in the 10th and then century?
Probably as a small chapel.
For worship.
But I mean, Paul may have lived here for a while. We don't really know.
They thought maybe he used it as a retreat.
We don't really know.
Okay.
Oh, the other thing, yeah, thanks Rachel, is that when you on close inspection you see that the eyes of Thecla and her hand have been gouged out of the fresco, which, I mean, who knows why, but oftentimes apparently that was done by succeeding generations to disempower the authorization of women to religious leadership. So very likely it was intentional as an act of denouncing her, to disfigure her image, her eyes and her hand. Well, there's another place nearby, not so far away, that told us more about Thecla, and it is the cave and the Basilica of St. Thecla. Now, here we learn Thecla had become a saint. She was a saint, is a saint of the Orthodox tradition. And I'm told there's a St. Thecla's church in Chicago. I don't know if it's Orthodox or Roman Catholic, but I understand it's a Polish church, probably a Polish Catholic church in Chicago. I want to go there sometime. And so in those traditions, you do hear more about St. Thecla. Here she is. So there's this grotto, or this cave, where, and here we are descending into it. Sarah Campbell, we see her back there leading the way, down into the grotto of St. Thecla. And Thecla, picking up her story, she did leave her family, even though Paul didn't permit her to come with him. She took up her own ministry. She became a healer and a teacher. Oh, there's Susie, who just came in a little while ago. Hi, Susie.
Oh, Susie. Another pilgrim.
Leading us through the grotto. And so she was living here apparently and teaching and healing from this cave at the end of her life, and I think she lived to about 70. There were many attempts on her life, especially by men who did not like what she was up to. And at the end, supposedly a group of men came to this grotto to kill her. And she vanished. She vanished. That's the story. She left.
The legend has it that she resurrected herself.
Yes. But she's quite an inspiration. Now, another place of the feminine divine that we went to in this area, we're still near Ephesus, is the home of the Virgin Mary. You remember from, we have this in the New Testament. Well, in fact, the story of the crucifixion. At the end, Jesus commissioned John to take care of his mother, to care for his mother. So supposedly, and there's a lot of evidence of this, John and Mary went to Ephesus about, well, sometime shortly after the death of Jesus, crucifixion of Jesus. So where did they go? Well, supposedly, I mean, John spent a great deal of time there, and he spent time on the island of Patmos, and of course he wrote, did much of his writing that's ended up in the New Testament there. And Mary was in a house somewhere. There was a lot of curiosity. Well, what house was she in? Or where was the house? Well, there was a German nun in the 19th century, 1870s, who had she'd never been to Ephesus. She had a vision that of this house, exactly what it looked like and where it was. And some years later, another German, I think about 20 years later, another German who was from one of the male religious orders, the Lazarites, I believe, he actually went and he located this place. And it totally fit the description of this German nun's vision. And then the Catholic Church took it up, is this or is this not the house? Pope Paul VI actually came in the 1960s and he said, yes, this is the place, this is the house where Mary lived out her life. And so it's become a place of pilgrimage since then. And it's a beautiful, beautiful place in a wooded area, beautiful stone house. I mean, I'm sure the house has been built and rebuilt over the centuries.
You can see the difference in stone, the original stone
Yes.
that was added onto.
Supposedly the foundations of the house do test out to first century structure there. So that's interesting. But this was a very special visit for me and for our delegation, and especially I think for Jim and Ginger up front here, who recommitted themselves, which was it, 45? 45th anniversary. We did a very simple, beautiful recommitment ceremony. Susie was the maid of honor, and Sarah Campbell officiated, and it was a wonderful, wonderful time. We also had a short worship service there as a group that was very meaningful, very, very beautiful time of prayer and communion. And in the previous picture, you saw me putting a prayer on the prayer wall. There was a wall, a long wall, maybe 50 feet long, and it was filled with these petitions and prayers that people had written and placed into this wire mesh on the wall. A beautiful, beautiful site of pilgrimage and a place to feel some powerful connection with Mary. Okay, Rachel.
Well, this was a part of the pilgrimage that that brought me into being a pilgrim. We had made a stop at our bus, which was very comfortable, and the roads were wonderful, by the way, and we would stop at the roadside rest stops. And there was another bus of Muslim women who were also on pilgrimage. And Dundar, our guide, began visiting with them to learn, and he learned that they too were on pilgrimage. And the woman was talking to him in Turkish, and several of us were listening in, not understanding what they were saying, but then Dundar would explain to us. And he turned and said that she is expressing her gratitude that you two are on pilgrimage also. And I happened to be standing kind of in the front of our little group listening in. And he said, now how would you respond in Turkish to that kind of statement? And somebody whispered in the back, I couldn't remember, but it's inshallah, which means God willing. So I heard Stephanie say it, so I said inshallah. She leaps up, she hugs me firmly to her bosom, and I tell you, it felt so good. And then she patted me all down and said, her blessing to me, so warm and wonderful. And I happened to have taken her picture before she hugged me. So that happened to be the rest stop called Mut, M-U-T. And in Turkish, Mut means happy. So I really remember that rest stop so well. But this really brings us into our whole experience with Islam. And of course, we were surrounded by people practicing Islam, and things have loosened up a bit in Turkey with the new leader, the Prime Minister Erdogan. So there is much more freedom for Muslims to practice publicly their religion. And this is upsetting to some Turkish people. We were visiting with friends last night who have a cousin in Izmir, and they're quite concerned that Islam will come to predominance and bad things will happen. But for us on this journey, it was really a very welcoming kind of environment, and it has helped me feel more at ease. And I know the Mayflower congregation here has this wonderful new housing unit that is embracing a lot of the Muslim people who are here in our own community and bringing you all closer to that culture. So our trip really benefited in that way. So then from Mut we went on up to heading into Konya, where Rumi, the great poet, lived and wrote his poetry. Move on to his mausoleum in Konya.
Okay, well, we've all heard a little bit of Rumi from Tom, because the poetry of Rumi is starting to work its way into Tom's sermons, which I think is wonderful. And so we began to learn a little about Rumi when we went to Konya. And my daughter-in-law had given me a book of poetry by Rumi. Rumi, living in the 13th century, and sometimes we think, well, he was Persian. Well, no, he was a Turk. He did spend a lot of time in Persia. He learned the Persian language, but he was a Muslim scholar and theologian, first and foremost, before he was a poet. And he was a great Muslim scholar. And but he settled in Konya. He and his father, this became their adopted home. And Rachel's going to say more about the Sema and the spiritual practice that he founded. But one of the highlights of our visit here was the chance to meet Rumi's granddaughter. I have to read her name. It's Esin Çelebi Bayru. Esin Çelebi Bayru, the woman on the right in the red, and is the granddaughter of Rumi to the 22nd generation.
Okay.
And she is a leader of the Sufi sect of Islam. Her English is fairly good. We had a wonderful dialogue with her. And she's sort of sensing that we were pilgrims, not necessarily typical tourists, that we were very interested in learning. It became very much a time of spiritual sharing. In fact, at the end, one of her students, a young man who is learning the Sema, came in and began to dance the Sema.
The dervish.
The dervish.
I mean, he's called the dervish.
Yes, yeah. So that was just a wonderful encounter with her and Rumi. That of course, is Bud, Fred Jones, standing. He was thrilled because this was such an important meeting.
But then when we traveled back to Istanbul, we went to a Muslim community center and experienced another Sema. And it was, so this is not in a mosque, but the instrument most spiritual to Rumi was the flute called the ney. It's out of bamboo. And some of you on our trip may have purchased a CD of the ney. We didn't. And it really is very trance-like and mesmerizing, the music. And that promotes the trance-like dance that the dervishes move into. And we have a few pictures of their twirling. And notice their hands, one hand, the left hand goes down to the earth and the right hand goes up to Allah, to God, and keeps a connection. And there's a whole ceremony of walking in the circle up previous to this. They come in black robes, and their cone-shaped hats are for the ego to become in tune. So you lose yourself. It's much like, transcendental meditation probably is, where you go into forgetting the thoughts, and connecting with the whirling energies of the universe. Because Rumi believed that we were all whirling all the time. And so they connect with that, and it's a beautiful, beautiful spin, and their feet move in such a way to keep them balanced. And then they close their eyes and do this twirling with their eyes closed, so they are really in tune with their bodies. So that was really nice.
Are there both men and women dancing?
Good observation. In this particular community, they allow women to, but traditionally, only men are allowed to practice the discipline of the Sema. And now it's opening up to women in Istanbul, which is much more progressive. After being in the countryside of Turkey, we did come back to Istanbul for several days, and our last two images are of the Hagia Sophia, which is technically translated as Church of the Holy Wisdom of God. And it originally was built as a church in the 6th century by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. And then when the Ottoman Turks came 1,000 years later, they converted it to a mosque and covered up a lot of plastered over the mosaics. And of course, again, earthquakes happen, and there was a lot of reconstruction, but all throughout time, the Ottoman sultans made sure that it was repaired and kept in good order. So now when you go to visit, it's a museum. In 1935, it became a museum. So it's interesting to see the layers of history as different parts of the artwork are being revealed. It doesn't refer to a Saint Sophia, but Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom. So it's...
But this would have been the primary cathedral of Christianity for 1,000 years, from like 500 till 1500.
Yeah, the patriarchy of the
This was it. I want to share just a couple of poems by Rumi. Come back to him. And for us, I think Rumi was very much part of the quest for the feminine divine. It was, if we think of feminism as something that transcends gender, it's a part of the human spirit, the human condition that transcends gender. Rumi, to me, very much a feminist poet and theologian of the 13th century. And let me just share his poems. Many of them are very, very short. But here's one on the search for God. Gamble everything for love if you're a true human being. If not, leave this gathering. Half-heartedness doesn't reach into majesty. You set out to find God, but then you keep stopping for long periods at mean-spirited roadhouses. Here's one on aging. This speaks to some of us. Childhood, youth, and maturity, and now old age. Every guest agrees to stay 3 days, no more. Master, you told me to remind you, time to go. And here's one about God and friendship. Lo, I am with you always. You promised that. And when I realized it was true, my soul flared up. Any unhappiness comes from forgetting. Remember and be back close with the friend. And maybe there's one more here.
You know, I
Here's
might
one on-
add
What?
that the Sema, the dance, really was created after Rumi's death as a way to keep his energy going, so to speak. And so it was done in memory of him and to keep that aliveness to the mystical part of Islam. And they believe, and I think too, you know, when you connect with the energies that are good in this world, good things happen. But if you get disconnected, you know, you're at that roadside stop that you mentioned in this poem. So it's a memorial to the dance.
It was very moving, I think, to all of us to discover how much respect and knowledge Islam has for aspects of Christianity. Jesus, Mary is the only female figure mentioned in the Quran, and we learned that Mary and versions of the name Mary is one of the most popular women's names in Islam, or in Turkey at least. And here's a poem where Rumi mentions Jesus and resurrection. Oh, this will be the last one. I called through your door. The mystics are gathering in the street. Come out. Leave me alone. I'm sick. I don't care if you're dead. Jesus is here and he wants to resurrect somebody. So, Rumi had a great sense of humor too.